Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm going to talk through the economic drivers from my perspective. I mentioned earlier the sorts of things we cover. So if we move on to the first slide, I can sort of let you know what we've been commissioned to do. I'm very happy to answer any questions on these areas. So we are inputting into the strategic and economic case for the development, also inputting into the sequential test, so the choice around site location, the employment and skills strategy, and the socioeconomic chapter. What I'm going to talk about today are sort of the three key elements, I guess, of those top three documents. So one is about the need for stage space. So why there's obviously been lots of news articles about new proposed expansions or studios here and there, and it can feel like there's an awful lot of capacity coming forward. So I want to take you through some of the numbers around the sheer scale of growth in this industry and the demand for those new space, and why we therefore strongly believe Marlow will still be needed despite all of those other schemes that are potentially in the pipeline. And then specifically in relation to the kind of sequential test, I want to talk about how we've thought about formally defining the location of this West London cluster, which is probably a terminology you have heard before, but it's generally been quite loosely defined before. And we've tried to take quite a robust and empirical and based on academic research approach to defining what might be that actual area, and therefore why do we end up with Marlow as a choice given that area. And then moving on to, we've talked about and we've estimated the kind of high level economic impact in terms of jobs and supply chain and so on, but thinking about our approach to an employment and education strategy to make sure that those benefits are maximised locally. So rather than just sort of plonking something somewhere and potentially not benefiting locals, how we can think about ways to work collaboratively with local education institutions and ensure those benefits go to the people who need them most and are maximised locally. And I guess all of those three then sort of come together into why Marlow and why it's a perfect location for a major film studio as the proposals are setting out. So I guess if I start on the first of those, the need for stage space. As an economist, I'm often asked to come in and look at an area and say we want to grow in this sector. This is our ideal sector. Please, can you tell us, we've got an aspiration for X, Y, and Z. Please, can you tell us how to deliver it? And it can often be quite disconcerting because you then go in and you look at the stats, and actually, although those people think they've got a speciality in a sector, the data doesn't support it. And this is the complete polar opposite of that, where I came in and I'm struggling to find a single statistic that doesn't support the extreme level of growth in this sector. And it's a really exciting one as an economist to be sort of faced with that problem, I suppose. And I've just put a few stats on this slide here, but there are loads of them. The value of the production industry in film and TV in 2019 globally was $177 billion. I think what's particularly exciting as the UK is that we're at the forefront of that. So around just under 20 billion of economic activity was supported in the UK in 2019 in the sector, which supports 173,000 jobs. From an economic perspective, another statistic we like to think about is the trade surplus. So that's the difference between imports and exports. So how much of a surplus we're creating for the economy. And the surplus in this sector is 4.3 billion. And that's relevant because one of the main drivers of national growth is to try and grow creative industries. And that surplus is actually about a quarter of the entire trade surplus of the creative industries. So it shows the importance, given how much weight national strategy is putting on growing the creative industries, and this is representing a quarter of that trade surplus. It shows you the magnitude of importance that this sector has. So advertising and market research, for example, contributes about 3.5 billion in trade surplus. So it's more than that, but in relative terms, quite similar. Another relevant stat in terms of where the money is coming from and where the investment is coming from is that around 84% was foreign direct investment. And so what therefore that means, particularly in the West London cluster, which I will come on to talk about, is that the UK and the cluster is not competing with the rest of the UK for this investment. So it's not like when you build other types of development, and you could argue that it's serving mostly a UK market, and therefore if it doesn't come here, it'll go somewhere else so that it can serve the UK. If films are not produced in the West London cluster, we're losing them to other countries. So we're not creating UK jobs. So from the terminology, I guess, that we use around that is additionality. There's a really high level of additionality and a very low level of displacement in this sector because there's so much demand and our competition is global rather than within the UK. And I guess what's driving that, and I'm always really sort of slightly saddened when I read these stats about the percentage of people's waking time that they spent during the pandemic watching Netflix and content, because I've got two very small children and I definitely didn't have any time to watch TV. But what this is being driven by is the extreme amount of investment there is to make content. And that's obviously being driven by the desire to digest and enjoy that and consume that content. So to watch TV, to watch films, and that has been growing rapidly over time. So Netflix subscriptions increased by 30% a year over an almost 10-year period from 2012 to 2020, for example. Percentage of time spent streaming content online doubled in just the 1 year period of the pandemic, which admittedly is an unusual time period, but it had been growing rapidly prior to that as well. Disney Plus attracted a record number of subscriptions just within its first 16 months of operation. What I'm saying there is that there's just this growing appetite to consume the sort of product that is produced in this space. And that's what's driving that global growth. And particularly in high-end TV and film production, which have been growing rapidly, those want to be produced in the UK. So that's what's driving this rate of growth. So if we move on to the next slide, reinforcing the fact that there is that growth, this is supported by both national and local policy. So there's a national target, and I'll come on to talk about this. There was a national target set in 2018 to double our revenues in the studio capacity and so on to 4 billion. That's already been exceeded. So that forecast was made in 2018 for what would happen in 2025, and we're only halfway to that, and we've had a global pandemic in the middle, and that's already been hit. The LEP also acknowledges the importance of creative industries to this area, which again I'll come on to when I talk about the West London cluster, but we're acknowledging what a specialty this area has in this industry. So it's recognised in national through to local policy as a really important sector in driving growth in the future. So I won't dwell on that too much. If we move on to the next slide, there's a couple more quotes from the recent skills report that Steve mentioned in his opening. This is a really good report. I'd really encourage anyone who wants to look at the detail to read this. It talks a lot about the specialism in creative industries in this area. So there's more than double the number of creative industry jobs within the Buckinghamshire economy than the national average. So that's a really strong indicator of that specialism in this location, many of which are in the film and TV sector. Obviously, there are other creative industries, but a lot of them are in that film and TV sector. And Buckinghamshire sits very much within the centre of that wider West London cluster, with all of those other studios noted on there. And thousands of jobs are expected to be created in the future in terms of projections for future growth. So as I say, it's supported right through from national to local policy in terms of being a growth sector that will deliver lots of new jobs and therefore require upskilling to access those jobs in the future. If we move on to the next slide now, just finally, in terms of why we still need space then to accommodate all of that growth in demand. At the moment, it's been estimated that estimated a few years ago that we were losing about 5 to 10 major blockbusters every year that wanted to be produced in the UK, but space wasn't here. So instead they were produced in other countries. Those have been worth about $1 billion each year in economic value. Just to put that in context, that's like losing the whole of Warwick University in its entirety and never getting it back, and just losing it year in, year out. It's a really big contributor to an economy. So it's to my point earlier about this kind of additionality point. Those blockbusters weren't made somewhere else in the UK because of the lack of space. They were just lost to another country. And the reason that space isn't there, well, in terms of this sort of the box chart on the left-hand side, only about a third of the existing studio space is in purpose-built studios. Quite a bit of it's in repurposed buildings or alternative space. And why is that important? Because ideally, most films want to be in purpose-built studios. They're more efficient, it's a better place to produce. And also in terms of future supply, those purpose-built are more likely to be there in the future to be providing that space, whereas there is a risk, particularly in the sort of situation we're in the area at the moment, there's massive demand for other commercial uses, including industrial. There's also demand for residential. So there's a potential that other sites could be, that are repurposed ones, could be lost in the future. So not only do we not have, that the stock we've got isn't all sort of perfect, shiny and purpose built, there's a potential we could lose some of that. And then in terms of the existing stock, utilization is very, very high. So Pinewood and Shepperton Studios averaged 85% over that period from 2014 to 2018. And then the following year, they were both tied down to long leasing deals with American companies. That essentially means they're now full. So other people can't come in and produce films in the way they used to at those studios because they've been taken for around a decade by Disney and Netflix. So they're all now owned or operated by those major US businesses, which makes it much harder for other players to come in and produce things. So they're effectively full. The next slide then just kind of takes you through some projections around what we think we'll need in the future. So about 3 years ago, I think it was, PwC did a forecast which said we would need about 940,000 square feet of stage space. And that would just accommodate those blockbusters that I just mentioned that we've been losing each year because they've been going elsewhere. So at the start of this chart, what you've got is the grey line at the bottom is the space we've got at the moment. The dotted line is what industry experts feel would be filled. If it was available now, it would be filled tomorrow. So the space we've got is already full. And if we just could click our fingers and open that space tomorrow, that would already be full. Since those forecasts, other forecasts have come out, all of which are considerably more bullish and higher in terms of the future need. So what we've done is we've taken on board, we've looked at all of those forecasts made by other people, which are all over different timeframes and looking at slightly different geographical areas. And we've made our own projections. And because economists are never in agreement and there will always be differences of opinion and there's always uncertainty about forecasts, we've included a range. So that's what that sort of green fan is showing you. And then the dotted line is the central scenario. And what we've looked at is historic trends. So we've looked at historic trends of the amount of money that has been spent in film production and high-end TV, those trends over time. And then we've looked at projecting them forward over a reasonable, just over a decade to 2033. And we've looked at different rates of growth, which essentially is what gives you that different range. And then that grey line at the bottom, we've added in the proposed and permitted expansions to have a look at where that would take us. And essentially what that's showing you is that we, even once we get the full opening of all of those sort of permitted studios that you'll all be aware of, we still only get to between the lowest and the central scenarios. So adding in Marlow just gets us more safely into that green bracket. It definitely doesn't take us into the realm of oversupply. What essentially that's telling us is that we can have a really good level of confidence that the demand to produce this level of content that would therefore occupy this space will be there in the future. So essentially that's that modelling approach we've taken. As I say, there are other forecasts out there, many of which are more bullish, some of which cover different timeframes, but we've tried to be quite sort of transparent and sort of show the uncertainty in what we've looked at in these forecasts. That covers, I guess, my first bit around the scale of space needed, the amount of space needed to produce films and high-end TV in the future. So now I'm just briefly going to talk about the West London cluster and what clusters are. This slide, I'm sorry, is a little bit sort of economic lecture-y style. And it's taken, there's a quote on the right-hand side from Michael Porter, who's a very famous economist known for essentially coming up with or introducing the term industry cluster. And he talks about the positive reinforcing feedback that we get in the cluster. So essentially, a cluster is an ecosystem of intertwined firms, individuals, institutions. So that can be people with skills, businesses that operate in an industry, institutions that train people, a whole variety of things that all contribute towards an area reaching critical mass in terms of skill sets, competencies, so that as a whole, the economy therefore has a competitive advantage over other areas, because the people and the businesses and the supply chain in that area are all working together and specialising in a given sector. What happens then when you've got those clusters is that they derive advantages from them. So because they have better skills and they can share, bounce ideas off each other, and they can brainstorm and they can compete, and they've got the infrastructure to work from, they're more productive, they're more innovative, and they compete. And as a result, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so it creates this positive feedback loop, which means that once you've got a cluster, the most efficient thing to do is to build on that cluster, because then not only do you get more of those benefits, but by having more, everybody's a bit more productive as well, the sort of the bouncing off each other spillover effects. So that's the sort of the economic theory, which has been well accepted and forms the basis of lots of policies. And that then forms the industrial policy, which is the kind of government position. Michael Porter sort of started off with it, which is that therefore it's generally accepted that the most efficient way to create economic growth, if you're lucky enough to have some clusters, is to build on and reinforce and reinvest in those clusters. So that's what a cluster is, why we care about them, why they're economically valuable. If we then move on to the next slide, what we've tried to do, clusters are organic in the way they set up. So they don't really fit economic geography in the way we would love them to from a statistical point of view. It would be great if we could just say, this is how you define a cluster, this is the data you collect, and here we go. But that's not how it works. And the West London cluster is largely accepted to exist. It's mentioned in, maybe with slightly different terminology, in all sorts of the planning documents supporting all of the different studios in Pinewood and in the BFC's publications. But it's quite a woolly definition in terms of exactly what we mean by that area. So what we've tried to do is take all of the research around what it is that is important to that cluster to define it from an empirical perspective. So it's just a couple of quotes up for you in there in terms of what industry experts have said about that cluster. And it's about technical talent, infrastructure, it's about access to construction crews, it's about this hub of opportunity. So what the map we've got there on the left-hand side of the screen is showing existing studios that we know to be within the cluster, and then the blue hashed lines are showing future studios where they've got permission to expand. And you can sort of broadly see a geography around those, and then the yellow dot is showing you where Marlow would be. And the size of the blob is the amount of studio space they've got, to give you the sort of scale of importance of those different locations across the area. So what we've then tried to do, if we go on to the next slide, we've looked at what the factors are that are important to that cluster. So I talked earlier about access to labour, access to supply chain, access to other businesses in the same industry. So what we've done is essentially look at those, and we've tried to define them from a data-driven perspective. So the top, the map on here labelled 1, that's looking at access to skilled crew. So we've delved down into the very smallest geographical area to look at where people live who are within the crew, the industries that make up the crew of film production. So they might be in film production themselves, they might be in artistic design, they might be in different things, but within that definition. And then not just where are they, which would be a slightly different map to this, but then for every place, how can you access, how many of those crew can you access? And that gives you a sort of density map or a heat map of access to that skilled crew. And that's what that number 1 map is showing. Then the second map is showing, and with sort of each one overlays the next measure on top of it to try and gauge where the centre of the cluster is going, if you see what I mean. The second one looks at the centrality to the cluster. So that's saying, given we know there is already a cluster and we know the main studios that are important to that cluster, how do we define the centre of those? So we've looked at the existing studios, we've weighted them by the size of those studios, And we've come up with a centre of the cluster and then a distance from that, which is the second measure. And I should say on each of these, the words there are just telling you where the site falls in that respect. So in terms of access to crew, it's just in the top 20%. It's very close to the centre of the cluster, which is very close to Pinewood. And then the third one is looking at access to airports. That was identified as being quite important because of the nature of the high-end TV and films that we're producing. You're often bringing in global talent from different places, and therefore being able to get them in and being in a place where they're happy to come to because they can get there easily, and then the journey's not too difficult for them, is important. So we looked at accessibility to airports. We did this across the whole of the UK, so we've also looked at it for different parts of the country as well. But that's what that one's showing. And then the fourth one is showing access to suppliers. So that's looking not at the crew who are specifically in the industry itself, but it's looking at the classic supply chain. So the other businesses that would service the supply chain and where they are. And again, it's that accessibility measure. And then we've overlaid each of those maps on top of each other, and we've taken a weighted average of the 4 different measures to come up with a definition of the cluster. And that's that final map, which is a bit small, but the blue and purple lines are essentially showing you 2 slightly different measures of weighting the 4 factors. And it's showing you the yellow dot, Marlow, is on the west-hand side of that cluster. So that's sort of telling you the why here. And yeah, that's the sort of the exercise we've gone through to think about where it needs to be and why. So finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about is a bit about education and employment. So one of the, I think, really exciting things here is that the client is genuinely committed to producing a best-in-class employment and skills strategy. We haven't got all of the answers yet. We haven't, got planning permission or built the thing yet. So it would be too early to have a completely in-depth plan of exactly which institution we're going to speak to and exactly what educational material we're going to provide to whom. But what we're trying to put in place is a really good set of guiding principles, speaking to all the right people to make sure we've got that structure there so that if permission is granted, we can be sure to maximise those employment and skills benefits across the area. And these are the sort of broad principles that we've been going through. So the first is engagement with a network of local schools. So that's about building awareness that this might happen, and then hopefully building excitement and raising aspirations with young people to understand the range of career opportunities in the industry. And I'll come on to talking a little bit about underrepresented groups in the industry. And one of the things we found there, and that's been reinforced by engagement with schools, is children from underrepresented groups. There's a question from Verity. Did you want to raise that now, Verity?
I think we'll take questions at the end because...
Oh, sorry, Harrison, sure, yeah.
Bill Morris has also posed a question. That's fine.
Yes, so one of the things we found with those underrepresented groups is that it's really important to them to have a relatable mentor, someone that they could see themselves becoming and therefore understand the pathway and the possibility of getting into that industry. So engaging with local schools to make sure they're aware about opportunities and how to maximise those opportunities is the first one. Second one, understanding how we can deliver educational programmes both within further and higher education. So creating programmes collaboratively with the institutions to make sure they're fit for purpose. So they deliver, they result in people that have the skills that will be needed by the end employers, but also can be delivered collaboratively with the education institutions and with the Marlow Studios Education and Skills Hub on site. Deliver pathways for the existing workforce. So this is to ensure that there are pathways into all sorts of different roles for different people. So thinking about what local priorities are, hosting local skills and training events, supporting existing initiatives, and trying to make sure that there's a really wide range of pathways to get as many people in as possible. Cultural impact, that's about engaging and educating people about the cultural impact and the importance of the studio, making sure there's access to events for people, access to services and facilities more widely. And then finally, environmental, social and governance. So this ongoing commitment to ensure we will work collaboratively with partners to deliver programmes that provide genuinely equal opportunities for all, and a really high commitment towards pastoral care, which I think is very important, particularly for young people coming into new professions. So there are ongoing discussions with lots of local and national skills providers to see how we might have that work. And what we're trying to do is learn from existing successes. So an example of that is we've been talking to Bucks New Uni, and they've got a health and social care academy model, which brings together lots of different employers, lots of different skills providers, brings in the colleges group, and delivers and then engages with the employer to make sure that the skills that are being delivered are fit for the end product. Now, obviously, health and social care is a different industry, but the model as bringing in those different skills bodies and different employers across the region is a really good one. So we're trying to learn from them about that. They also obviously run a lot of programs collaboratively with Pinewood anyway in many of these technical disciplines. So there's also things to be learned there. So we're having a breadth of those discussions to make sure we get the detail we need from them to embed that into our employment and skills strategy. This is just giving you a bit of an example of the sorts of jobs that there are within film and high-end TV sector. I won't read through all of these, but there's a really wide range. We're not just talking about people, acting in a film or producing a film. We're talking about the full range of people in, arts and crafts, technical, lighting, sound, all sorts of different things, and post-production as well. And then sales, marketing, distribution. So there's a really wide range of creative roles with different skill sets required for them. And then the next slide just talks about where there is provision in nearby colleges. This sort of feeds into the clustering point I mentioned earlier as well, in terms of that cluster of not just the studios producing the end product, and the people and the crew and the supply chain, but also the educational institutions that train people up in a really wide range. I think one of the National Film and Television School actually ranks 4th nationally for the employability of its graduates, which is a really great stat in terms of making sure that they're actually well-rounded and employable at the end of their training. But there's a really wide range of options here. And as I say, we've been talking to all of these and trying to understand how we can work collaboratively with them all going forwards. And then the last couple of slides, I was just going to talk through underrepresented groups, because this comes up a lot when we're developing employment and skills strategies, and this is really important to us to make sure the strategy we develop does result in a fairer, more inclusive set of opportunities in the future. And I think this is important. Unfortunately, underrepresented groups are typically underrepresented in a vast range of sectors. So this isn't unique in that sense, unfortunately. But one of the things is, because of the scale of growth, it's not as though the industry can just sit back and rely on existing skilled people who are sitting out there waiting to work on new films. The skills strategy which Bucks produced, which and the BFC have published articles on this as well, there's a skills shortage in this industry. So we will need to upskill people to get them ready to take these opportunities. Now that presents a challenge, but it also presents a great opportunity, because it means we can't just stick in our old ways of the same people coming through and getting these opportunities. We will need to make sure these opportunities are more widely available. And why is that important? Because when we look at the stats, unfortunately, so what this is showing is that in screen industries, a much higher proportion of people come from a privileged background. The quote at the top is essentially saying, when you speak to people in the industry, unfortunately, what you find is people get filtered out because they have to rely on the bank of mum and dad for a period of time while they're early in their career, and therefore people who are from less privileged, lower income backgrounds just can't get into the sector. And the picture in the middle of here, which you will be able to read when you see the slides afterwards, talks about how those disadvantages across life stages build up on one another. So at the primary age, you're less likely to be taken to a cultural museum or have access to people and knowing about career opportunities. Then you're much less likely to get educational work experience. Then you're less likely to be able to train and get support. And it just sort of builds on that imbalance right from a young age all the way through. And it's about breaking that down and tackling it at every single level wherever we can. And I'm conscious there's lots of questions, so I'm going to speed through these. This one's just showing the skill set So this is showing it's a highly skilled industry, which again, building on what I said earlier, makes it hard to get into if you haven't been able to get those skills throughout your lifetime. So it's about upskilling people and maybe offering more accessible routes in, so more apprenticeships, for example, rather than necessarily always needing a degree. And then the next one is just looking at the other underrepresented groups. So women typically are much less represented in this sector than the average across all industries. A lot of research has been done into this, basically showing that the more, and this is true actually across lots of sectors, the more you've got women sort of at the top, so directing films, the more the women in the films are likely to be better portrayed, and the women are going to have better opportunities throughout that process. The other chart here is about ethnicity, and actually, interestingly, the stats show that as a whole, the industry isn't as underrepresented as I thought it might be with ethnic minorities. Shockingly, ethnic minorities, unfortunately, are underrepresented just in all sectors. But when you delve into the detail, and that's in this report that's quite referred to here, what you find is disparity in terms of what types of roles they get. So they tend to be in the lower skilled, less well paid job opportunities. So again, there is still a barrier there that needs to be worked through. And I'm conscious I've probably overrun. So my very last slide is just bringing all that together and say, why Marlow? And I won't repeat the things I've said, but essentially, this is one of the fastest growing sectors nationally and internationally. It's of national significance. It has, the creative industries are what we're putting a lot of weight on to bring us out of the pandemic and deliver more jobs in the future. The location, the West London cluster, is where those films and high-end TV productions want to be produced. That's where the space needs to be. And therefore, even given the expansions that have already been permitted, we will need more space. There's that cluster benefit, so that if we deliver that space, there will be feedback loops, there will be supply chain benefits, there will be positive benefits amplified throughout the community. We need purpose-built facilities. At the moment, we're lacking in that across the country, so and across the West London clusters. So Marlow Studios would be purpose-built and would be, a very well-designed studio. And then there'll be lots of economic and social benefits. I've talked about sort of the job creation is estimated to be over 4,000 jobs, about half of which are directly on site, the other half are indirectly through the supply chain. That will deliver annual economic output each year, which a proportion of which obviously goes into central government in terms of tax revenues and increases exports. So there are lots of positive impacts there from an economic perspective. And then social value, which really builds on how we need to deliver a really great employment and skills strategy to make sure as many of those benefits can be felt locally as possible, because then we can start to tackle some of those barriers that already exist and hopefully tackle them positively. And really, when we look at the area, there isn't really a genuine alternative. So it really does have to be in this location. And then just finishing up, and there's lots of quotes, and it's, again, as I said at the start, it's a great one to come to as an economist, because sort of every day there's another news article that gives you another stat or another quote. But essentially what we're finding, even just in 3 days over December, there were a load of quotes around the boom in TV and film production in the UK, and how we can't be left behind by global players. We need to invest in this industry. We need to deliver the space and invest in the skills to mean we've got the physical space and the human capital to continue growing this industry, which is of national importance. And I will stop there.